This is my true story. I spent my whole life making sure my son never went without anything. I worked double shifts, saved every dollar, and believed one day he'd remember that kind of love. But the night before my birthday, he called and said, "Mom, I'm too busy this week." Not sorry, not hesitant, just busy. I smiled, hung up, and decided silence would speak louder than anger. What I did next changed everything. Before I tell you, write your city and time in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so stories like mine can reach more people. He called the night before my birthday. His voice sounded distant, rushed, as if he was already halfway out of the conversation before it even started. He said he was too busy this week, that things at work were piling up, and he'd call me later when things settled down. He didn't even ask how I was or if I had any plans for the day. I said it was fine because that's what I always said when he disappointed me. I hung up and sat there for a while, holding the phone in my hand, wondering when our conversations had become obligations instead of care. It wasn't anger that I felt. It was something quieter, heavier, like the slow understanding that maybe this was who he had become now. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house. There was no knock on the door, no message, no sound that belonged to anyone but me. I decided I wouldn't let the day pass unnoticed, even if it was only me celebrating it. I went to the kitchen, took out a small pan, and made myself a cake. It wasn't fancy, just simple chocolate, the kind I used to bake for him when he was little. I remembered how he'd sit at the counter waiting for the first slice, grinning, his fingers always sneaking frosting before it cooled. The memory came back to me while I stirred the batter. For a moment I smiled, then it faded. That boy didn't exist anymore. He'd grown into a man who didn't remember the hands that made those cakes, or the woman who made sure he never went to bed hungry. When the cake was ready, I lit one small candle and sat at the table. I looked at the flame for a long time before blowing it out. I didn't make a wish. I didn't need to. The day wasn't about wishes anymore. It was about realization. I cut a piece, ate slowly, and let the taste bring back the years I had given him. The flavor was sweet, but the feeling wasn't. It was like swallowing a reminder that love can't survive on memories alone. After I finished, I cleaned the plate, washed the pan, and put everything back exactly where it belonged. The kitchen looked the same, but something in me didn't. I had finally understood that if I kept waiting for him to care, I'd keep disappointing myself. I sat by the window that evening, watching the sky turn orange and then gray. The world outside was alive, moving, celebrating someone else's birthday, somewhere else. Mine didn't need anyone else to witness it. I thought about how many times I had been there for him, through sickness, heartbreak, failure, and how easily he had pushed me aside now that he didn't need help. I realized that love had turned into habit for him, and habit doesn't inspire gratitude. It expects availability. That's what I had been to him. Available. Always there. Always ready. Always saying yes, even when it hurt. It had never crossed his mind that one day my patience might end. When night fell, I took one last look at my phone. It was silent, just as I expected. No message, no call. I turned it face down on the table and walked to my room. I wasn't sad anymore. I was certain. I lay in bed thinking about all the chances I had given him to treat me better and how every single one had been wasted. But this time, there would be no anger, no confrontation, no begging for attention. This time, the lesson wouldn't come from my words. It would come from my choices. And unlike him, I wouldn't forget the day it began. When I think about everything I did for him, it feels like looking back at a life spent building someone else's foundation. Every corner of his success was laid on top of something I sacrificed. I worked long hours so he could have a good education. I skipped meals to make sure he had enough food for his lunch at school. I stayed up through the nights when he was sick, whispering small prayers that he'd grow strong, believing that every bit of effort would come back one day in the form of respect. I believed raising a child with love guaranteed kindness in return. I was wrong. It guaranteed dependency, but not gratitude. When he grew up, he used to call often, always starting with sweet words and ending with requests. The tone was always the same, warm at the start, cold by the end. I told myself it was fine, that children were busy and grown-up life was hard, but deep down I knew that love shouldn't always feel like a transaction. He needed money for college and I found a way. I took a small loan, promising myself I'd repay it even if it took years. He finished his studies and thanked me once, but I could tell his words were just habit, not appreciation. When he got married, I paid for most of the wedding because he said he didn't want to start his new life in debt. I smiled at the ceremony, proud and hopeful, even though a part of me already knew that I was more of a stepping stone than a mother. Every major event in his life had my fingerprints on it, but he only saw the results, never the work behind them. When he wanted a house, I gave him the deposit. When his first business failed, I gave him another loan. When his marriage fell apart, I was the one who took him in, fed him, and told him that life would start over. I stood by him like a shadow, invisible but always there, cleaning up behind the storms he created. Through all those years, I never once asked for anything. Not money, not repayment, not even time. I only wanted to be treated with basic decency, a phone call now and then, a visit that didn't feel like an obligation, a thank you that sounded sincere. But gratitude doesn't grow in people who never learned it. He started to treat my help as his right. He'd call when he needed something and disappear when he didn't. I'd hear his voice only when bills piled up or when he'd lost another job. And every time, I'd help again, thinking maybe this time he'd see that love was supposed to go both ways. But it never did. Every time he said thank you, it sounded thinner. Every time he promised to visit, it was delayed. Every year that passed, my effort became something he expected, not something he respected. When I look back now, I can see where I went wrong. I mistook love for duty and patience for loyalty. I believed that giving him everything would teach him generosity, but instead it taught him comfort. He learned that I would always be there, no matter how little he offered in return. And I was, until the moment I realized I had become invisible in my own story. Parents always think they can earn love by giving more, but love that needs earning isn't real. It's dependence disguised as affection. That's what our relationship had turned into, an endless loop of giving and taking, where only one side remembered the balance. When he forgot my birthday, all of it came back. Every sacrifice, every late night, every time I chose his happiness over my own. It wasn't just about the day he forgot. It was about the years he had forgotten everything that mattered. I realized that I had spent a lifetime trying to keep him safe, while he had spent his adulthood pretending I didn't matter. The kindness I thought I was teaching him had become the tool he used to take me for granted. That was the day I stopped feeling guilty for wanting to put my energy elsewhere. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was fairness. I had carried him through life. It was time to carry myself. Clara was never the kind of woman who caused problems. Even when the marriage ended, she didn't speak badly about my son. She simply moved on, quietly, like someone who understood that dignity was worth more than revenge. I had liked her from the first day I met her. She was polite, grounded, and gentle with everyone in the family. She didn't try to impress or outshine anyone. She cooked simple meals, helped me in the kitchen, and treated me with the kind of respect that comes naturally, not forced out of obligation. When she left, it wasn't because she wanted to. It was because she had reached her limit. My son didn't see the difference between love and convenience, and she was the one who finally decided she wouldn't live like that anymore. She left him with the same quiet strength she had lived with. No shouting, no drama, just finality. I understood her decision more than he did, though I never said it aloud. After the divorce, most people expected her to vanish from my life, but she didn't. On holidays, she would send me cards with handwritten notes, sometimes pictures of my granddaughter. Even though her life had become more difficult, she never stopped being kind. I could see the struggle in her eyes the few times we met, working 2 jobs, raising a child alone, trying to stay strong while keeping her dignity intact. She never complained, never asked for help, never tried to make me choose sides. She respected the bond that existed before everything fell apart. My son, on the other hand, spoke of her with bitterness, blaming her for his failures, his loneliness, and even his debts. He couldn't see that she wasn't the problem. His entitlement was. Every story he told about her made her sound like the villain, but I had been there long enough to know better. I had seen how she tried to hold that marriage together when he barely tried at all. Years passed and my son remarried. The new wife was younger, flashier, and loud in all the wrong ways. I tried to welcome her, but there was no warmth in return. She treated me like an obligation she had to tolerate. She never looked me in the eye when she spoke and corrected my every small action as if I were a guest overstaying my welcome. That's when I realized Clara had been the only woman who truly cared about the family, not just the image of it. The difference was painful to admit, but it was clear. Clara had never seen me as a burden. She saw me as family. The new one saw me as decoration, something to be tolerated for the sake of appearance. I kept quiet, as I always did, but I never forgot who had shown me real respect. When the years grew harder for Clara, I watched from a distance as she built herself back up. She worked mornings at a bakery and evenings at a diner. She raised her daughter with patience and strength, teaching her to be kind but never weak. She sent me small gifts, a knitted scarf, homemade cookies, a drawing her daughter made for me. Each gesture reminded me that love doesn't need titles to be real. She wasn't my daughter-in-law anymore, but she treated me like her own mother anyway. And every time I looked at those small gifts, I thought about the difference between someone who takes and someone who gives. My son had taken everything, my money, my time, my faith, and offered back excuses. Clara had lost everything and still found ways to give. So when my son forgot my birthday, it wasn't difficult to decide who deserved something from me. It wasn't about choosing sides anymore. It was about recognizing who had earned a place in my heart through actions, not words. Clara had never disrespected me. She had never forgotten me. She had kept me in her life without expectation or benefit. That kind of loyalty deserves acknowledgement. While my son was busy building a new life, too proud to look back, she was rebuilding hers with gratitude and grace. I realized that the only difference between them was character, something no amount of money or success could fake. She had lost her marriage but kept her values. He had kept his pride but lost his decency. And in that comparison, my decision was simple. The next time I gave something, it wouldn't go to blood. It would go to the person who remembered me when no one else did. The morning after my birthday, I woke up with a clear mind. The silence in the house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt purposeful, like something inside me had settled after years of being ignored. I made my tea, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the stack of old bills, letters, and notebooks I kept in the drawer by the fridge. Somewhere underneath them was my checkbook, the same one I'd used to pay for his college, his first house, and a dozen other things he never remembered. The pages were almost empty now, but one blank check remained. I pulled it out, placed it on the table, and stared at the space where a name should go. For a moment, I thought about writing his name again, about continuing the cycle I had built around him, but something inside me refused. That single line wasn't just about money. It was about acknowledgement. It was about deciding who deserved to be seen, and this time, it wasn't him. I thought of Clara then. Her face, her patience, the quiet strength she carried even when life was hard. I remembered the way she used to bring me flowers on Sundays, not expensive ones, just small wildflowers tied together with string. I thought about her kindness, the way she had checked on me after the divorce, not because she wanted anything, but because she genuinely cared. I thought about how she worked without complaint, never asking anyone to feel sorry for her. The decision came easily after that. I took my pen, wrote her name in neat, steady letters, and filled in the amount. It wasn't large enough to change her life completely, but it was enough to start something new, enough to show her that good people deserve help, even when others have forgotten them. On the memo line, I wrote 5 simple words, for someone who remembers birthdays. It wasn't meant to be a message to my son, but I knew it would reach him anyway, in its own time, through its consequences. When I sealed the envelope, I didn't feel guilt. I felt relief. I placed it carefully in my handbag and walked to the post office after lunch. The air outside was warm, the kind of weather that makes you feel both small and free. The clerk behind the counter asked if I wanted to send it by express or regular mail. I said regular. It didn't need to rush. Lessons are better when they arrive quietly. I watched her weigh the envelope, stamp it, and slide it into the bin. That was it. The check was gone, and so was the last piece of hesitation I'd carried about doing what was right for myself. On the walk home, I passed a bakery with a for lease sign in the window, and I smiled a little. It looked like the kind of place Clara might make something beautiful out of if she ever got the chance. When I returned home, I sat by the window again, the same spot where I'd waited for his call just 2 days earlier. The phone was still silent, but now I didn't care. I had stopped waiting for noise that never meant anything. I looked around the house, the walls I painted myself, the furniture I bought secondhand, the things that had stood the test of time even when people hadn't, and felt a kind of pride I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I had chosen to give from a place of strength, not habit. That small piece of paper in the mail was more than a check. It was a boundary, a declaration that love doesn't have to tolerate neglect. That evening, I made dinner for myself, simple soup and bread. The kind of meal Clara would have enjoyed. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. I didn't need to. It wasn't about revenge or teaching him a lesson. It was about setting the balance right. Somewhere I knew she would smile when she opened that envelope. I imagined her sitting at her kitchen table, maybe tired after work, unfolding the letter and seeing her name in my handwriting. She would understand immediately. She would know it came from a place of respect, not pity. And my son, when he eventually found out, would understand something else entirely. That love without appreciation has an expiration date. I didn't have to explain it. The mail would do it for me. The first day after sending the check passed slowly but peacefully. I woke up earlier than usual, made my bed neatly, and brewed my coffee without thinking about the phone. I didn't expect a message, and for once, that felt freeing. I cleaned the kitchen, watered the plants, and sat in the garden for a long while, listening to the birds and watching the morning sunlight spill through the leaves. My birthday had come and gone, but something about that morning felt more like a beginning than an end. The air in the house felt lighter. There was no lingering disappointment, no sadness clinging to the quiet. It was the kind of silence that comes after a decision you know you won't regret. For years, I had measured my worth through my son's attention, waiting for him to call, waiting for him to remember, waiting for him to care. Now I realized I didn't need any of it. I had done something meaningful, not for validation, but for balance. Later that afternoon, I walked to the market. People greeted me with polite smiles, the same ones they always had, and I smiled back. I bought vegetables, some milk, and a small bouquet of white daisies for the table. It wasn't a celebration, but it felt like one. When I got home, I cooked a proper meal and set the table for one without feeling embarrassed about it. Solitude no longer felt like punishment. It felt earned. I sat down to eat, enjoying every bite, knowing that while my son had dismissed me with excuses, someone else, someone who had once been part of our family, was about to receive something that might help her build again. The thought gave me peace. I didn't need to tell anyone. I didn't need to share it. It was enough knowing I had done what was right. By evening, I turned off the lights early. I sat in bed reading, something I hadn't done in a long time. I didn't think about the past or the future. For the first time in years, I felt content with the present. I fell asleep easily, the kind of sleep that comes when you stop expecting apologies that will never arrive. The next morning, I woke up feeling rested. I made breakfast and opened the windows to let the cool air in. The world outside continued as it always had, cars passing, dogs barking, neighbors walking their children to school. I felt invisible, but not forgotten. Not by everyone, at least. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was an old friend from the church. Her voice carried a soft laughter, the kind that usually comes when someone has a story to share. She told me she'd seen something online, a post that had made her think of me. Clara had written it. The post was short, just a few lines beneath a photograph of her standing in front of a small bakery with a wooden sign that read, "Sweet Haven, Grand Opening." She was wearing her apron, her hair tied back, a little flower on her cheek. The caption said, "New beginnings are built by kindness. Thank you to the angel who believed in me." My friend asked if I had seen it, but I said no. I didn't need to. I already knew what that meant. My check had arrived. The world had moved exactly as it should. I thanked my friend, wished her a good day, and ended the call. Then I sat in the same chair where I'd baked my cake just days earlier and smiled. Not the forced kind of smile you use to hide pain, but the real kind, the one that comes when justice meets grace. The rest of the day passed without noise. I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't scroll through messages or check for updates. I just let the peace stay. I didn't feel proud in the way people do when they win something. I felt calm, steady, like a storm had finally passed. That night, I turned off the phone before bed. I didn't need to see who remembered me or who didn't. I knew where my heart had gone, and that was enough. 2 days had passed since I mailed that check. It wasn't just money that traveled through the post. It was a message, one that would land where it was needed and echo where it was deserved. I went to sleep that night knowing the balance had shifted. For years, I had waited for my son to remember me. Now, someone else had. The next morning began like any other. The sun came through the curtains, the kettle whistled, and the smell of coffee filled the house. I was halfway through my first cup when the phone started buzzing on the table. It wasn't unusual for someone to call early, but the sound didn't stop. It rang once, twice, 3 times, until I finally looked down and saw his name on the screen. I didn't answer. I let it ring until it went silent. Then it rang again. I turned the phone face down and finished my coffee slowly, pretending not to notice. It rang 8 more times before I even moved from my chair. The first thought that crossed my mind wasn't worry. It was curiosity. What could possibly make him call so many times after ignoring me for days? By noon, I checked the screen. 23 missed calls, all from him. For the first time in years, it wasn't me chasing his voice. It was him chasing mine. I sat there, calm, watching the number climb. The silence between each call said more than words ever could. He must have found out about the check by then. I didn't need to ask how. The world travels fast when pride is bruised. I could imagine his face, confusion turning to anger, then disbelief. He would have called the bank first, asked why the money was missing, and they would have told him it had been issued to another account. Then he would have called me, expecting me to explain, expecting me to justify. That's how he lived, assuming I owed him explanations, as if every decision I made needed his permission. But this time was different. This time the decision had already traveled, cleared, and landed in someone else's hands. There was nothing left to question. He could call 100 times, and it wouldn't change what I had done. By afternoon, my curiosity softened into amusement. I wasn't angry anymore. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that for once, he was the one waiting for me. Every vibration of the phone felt like a reversal of years of neglect. He had made me wait for calls that never came. Now he was waiting for one that never would. That balance, that quiet shift, was worth every second of peace I had claimed. I picked up the phone once, looked at his name flashing again, and almost laughed. There was no need to answer. The silence was the answer. Hours passed, and eventually the calls stopped. A text came through instead. Just one short message. "Mom, did you give her money?" I read it twice, not because I was unsure what it meant, but because of the tone behind it. There was no kindness, no curiosity, just entitlement. Even now, it wasn't about concern. It was about control. He didn't ask why. He asked if. He wanted confirmation that his assumptions were right. I didn't owe him that. I typed my reply slowly. Yes. Birthday gift. I didn't explain further. I didn't justify. I didn't add a single extra word. I pressed send, set the phone down, and returned to my book. The message was short, but the silence that followed it was long. He didn't reply. Not right away, anyway. I could picture the scene playing out in his mind. The disbelief, the anger, the realization that I had acted without him. He had built his sense of authority around the idea that I would always ask for his approval, that I would always be there to bail him out, that I wouldn't move without consulting him. But the check broke that illusion. It wasn't about money, it was about independence. For the first time, I had reminded him that I wasn't his safety net. I was a person, a mother, yes, but a mother with limits. That evening, the calls began again. This time, fewer but more desperate. I didn't answer those either. I let the phone ring until the light on the screen dimmed. Each unanswered call wasn't neglect. It was a boundary. I had spent too many years giving him my time while he gave me excuses. I owed him nothing anymore. If he wanted to talk, He'd have to learn how to listen first. When the house went quiet again, I turned off the phone and sat by the window. The air outside was still, the street empty, the sky dimming into orange. Somewhere across town, he was probably pacing in frustration, realizing that his voice no longer carried the power it once did. And for the first time in a long time, I felt calm. Not because I had hurt him, but because I had stopped letting him hurt me. By nightfall, the calls had stopped entirely. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. 23 missed calls, each one a reminder that he finally understood what being ignored felt like. He had given me years of quiet neglect. I had given him one day of deliberate silence. It was a fair exchange. The next evening, just after sunset, I heard the familiar sound of tires rolling onto the gravel outside. It was steady at first, then abrupt, like someone braking harder than they intended. I didn't move right away. I sat still at the table, my cup of tea still warm, my book still open. Through the thin curtain, I saw his car parked crookedly in the driveway. He didn't even close the door properly. It swung once before catching the wind and slamming shut. He hadn't called this time. No warning, no message, just arrival. I could already sense the heat of anger before he even reached the porch. When the knock came, it was hard, impatient, the kind of knock people use when they think the door owes them an answer. I didn't rush to open it. I let him knock again. The silence between each strike of his hand on the door told me everything. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to scold. When I finally opened the door, he was standing there with that look I had seen so many times before, anger trying to hide guilt. His eyes darted past me into the house, as if checking that no one else was there. His voice was sharp when he started to speak. I didn't interrupt. I let the words fall in waves. He said he couldn't believe what I had done. He said I had embarrassed him, made him look foolish, betrayed his trust. Every sentence was a complaint dressed as disappointment. He spoke like a man wounded by pride, not love. I stood quietly, letting him use his anger like a shield. It didn't bother me. I'd spent too many years absorbing his frustration for things that weren't my fault. When he finally paused, I turned and walked toward the kitchen. I didn't tell him to follow, but he did. The air between us was heavy. He paced behind me, repeating the same things over and over. He said she didn't deserve my help. He said she had ruined his life, and now I was rewarding her for it. His voice cracked when he spoke her name. I could tell the wound was still there, even if he pretended it wasn't. I poured a cup of coffee and placed it on the table in front of him. He didn't touch it. He just kept talking, louder now, his hands gesturing, his face red. I listened. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. Everything he was saying came from pride, not reason. When he ran out of breath, there was silence again. That silence used to scare him when he was a boy. It meant I was serious. Now it scared him for a different reason. It meant I had stopped being affected. He asked me why I did it. I didn't answer right away. I looked at him for a long moment and thought about the years behind us, the sacrifices, the patience, the blind loyalty. He had been given everything, and still he had learned nothing. Finally, I said what needed to be said, calmly and clearly. I told him I had given Clara the money because she had earned it. Not through blood, but through respect. I told him she had remembered me when he hadn't, that she had treated me like family even when she didn't have to. I told him birthdays weren't about presents, they were about acknowledgement. And since he hadn't remembered me, I had chosen to give my gift to someone who had. He stared at me, his mouth half open but empty of words. The truth was standing between us, too heavy to deny. He had no defense left. The anger drained from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. He sat down in the chair across from me and looked at his hands. There was no more shouting, no more excuses. The silence returned, but this time, it was mine. I let him sit there quiet, realizing what he had done, not just this week, but over years of taking without giving back. When he finally stood up, he didn't look me in the eye. He mumbled something about leaving, about needing air, but his voice was small now, uncertain. He walked toward the door without waiting for me to respond. I watched him go, the same way I had watched him leave so many times before, But this time, I didn't feel sadness following him out. I felt peace. The truth had been said, the line had been drawn, and the silence that once felt cold now felt protective. After the door closed, the house went still again. I finished my tea. It had gone cold, but I didn't mind. I cleaned the cup, turned off the lights, and went to bed early. Outside, his car started, then paused for a moment before driving off into the night. He had arrived full of anger and left full of reflection. That was enough. I didn't need an apology. The quiet that followed was apology enough. The next morning arrived without noise. The light came through the curtains softly, stretching across the room in thin lines. I could still feel the weight of last night lingering in the air, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind that follows when something final has been said. I sat at the table with my coffee, the same table where he had stood shouting hours earlier. His coffee cup was still there, untouched, a small ring of cold liquid left at the bottom. It looked like proof of how unfinished he had become in his own mess. How many conversations he had started but never completed. How many things he had taken for granted and never acknowledged. I didn't touch it. I just let it sit there, a quiet reminder that sometimes silence is louder than any apology. The phone didn't ring that day. It didn't need to. He had nothing left to say, and I had no interest in hearing excuses. I knew my son well enough to understand how his mind worked. He would spend the day angry, replaying our talk, twisting my words into something that made him feel like a victim. He'd tell himself I had humiliated him, that I'd taken sides, that I'd chosen his ex-wife over him. It was easier for him to be hurt than honest. But somewhere beneath that pride, he'd remember the truth. He'd remember the tone of my voice when I told him I wasn't angry, just disappointed. He'd remember the look on my face when I said I gave to those who respected me, and that memory would work on him longer than any argument ever could. Pride fades faster than guilt. I spent that morning doing what I always did, laundry, dishes, watering the plants. But everything felt lighter. Every simple task was easier when I wasn't carrying resentment. I didn't need to explain myself or defend my choices. I had spent years building his life, and now I had built my own peace. That was enough. When I finished, I sat by the window and watched a few children walking to school. They laughed as they ran past the gate, their voices filling the street. It made me think of him when he was young, running home from school, waving his backpack in the air, proud of every small accomplishment. Back then, he used to tell me everything. Now he told me nothing unless it benefited him. That was the change adulthood had brought, not wisdom, just distance. He had grown older, but not kinder. Around noon, I made myself lunch and turned on the radio. The news played softly in the background. My mind drifted between the past and present, between all the moments I had spent trying to be patient and all the times he had mistaken that patience for weakness. When people think you'll never stop forgiving them, they stop respecting the forgiveness you give. That's what had happened to us. My love had become invisible, something expected, not appreciated, but that chapter had closed now. I didn't need him to understand why I did what I did. I just needed him to feel the difference between entitlement and gratitude. By the afternoon, I received a call from Clara. Her voice was gentle, calm, full of warmth. She didn't talk about the money directly, but I could hear the gratitude in every word she spoke. She said she'd been able to buy new supplies for the bakery and that customers were already stopping by. She talked about the smell of fresh bread filling the air, the way her daughter smiled when people came in to buy something. I listened quietly, smiling to myself. She didn't say thank you, and she didn't need to. Her tone said everything. That conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it meant more than any call from my son ever had. When I hung up, the silence in the house felt different now, warm, earned, alive. That evening, my son called again. The screen lit up with his name glowing in the dark kitchen. I watched it ring until it stopped. There was no satisfaction in ignoring it, just calm acceptance. He needed time to face himself. He had walked through life believing that love would always wait for him, but that illusion had finally broken. I didn't need to tell him what he'd done wrong. He already knew. I could feel it in the way he avoided words, in the way his anger had vanished without resolution. The silence between us wasn't punishment. It was understanding. He had finally learned what it felt like to be on the other side of neglect. When night came, I sat by the window again, my old routine returning. The street outside was empty, and the wind made the trees sway slowly. I looked at the sky, at the faint line of stars appearing one by one, and I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known before. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for a call, an apology, or a sign. I had already received the only thing that mattered, closure. I had given him everything once, and he had learned nothing. Now, by giving someone else something small, I had reminded him of everything he had lost. Some lessons don't need words, they just need time to sink in. The days that followed were quiet, but they didn't feel empty. The kind of silence that used to make me uneasy now felt peaceful, like the house had finally found its natural rhythm again. I went about my routine as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. There was no more waiting for his calls, no more wondering if he'd drop by out of obligation. I had accepted that the distance wasn't punishment, it was balance. The mornings felt cleaner, the air lighter. I could finally drink my coffee without checking the phone, without the lingering hope that he might remember me. Freedom, I realized, doesn't always come from what you gain. It often comes from what you stop expecting. For years, I had waited for my son to see me as more than a source of support, but now I understood something clearer. Respect is not owed by blood, it's earned by behavior. And my son, for all his achievements, had failed that simple test. Clara's bakery opened a few weeks later, and the news spread quietly through the neighborhood. It wasn't a grand opening with banners or fanfare, just a small shop with soft lights, the smell of fresh bread drifting through the air, and a woman behind the counter who smiled like she'd finally caught her breath after years of holding it in. People came in out of curiosity at first, then started returning because the food was good and the warmth felt genuine. I walked by one morning and saw her through the glass, helping a customer, her apron dusted with flour. She didn't see me, but I stood there for a while, proud without needing to say it out loud. There was something satisfying about seeing goodness rewarded. She had worked hard without complaint, and now she was building something real. That check I sent had become something more than money. It had become motion, the kind that changes direction without noise. A few days later, she came to visit. She brought a basket filled with bread, small pastries, and a note folded neatly inside. She didn't mention the check, and neither did I. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, the bakery, her daughter's school, but between every word was an unspoken understanding. She didn't need to thank me, and I didn't need to remind her. Gratitude doesn't always live in words. Sometimes it just sits quietly in gestures. When she left, the house smelled of bread and warmth. It had been a long time since kindness had entered this home without strings attached. I sat with her note after she left. It was short, written in her careful handwriting. Some people give out of duty, others give out of love. I will never forget which one you were. I placed it inside the old checkbook, right where my son's name used to be written over and over again. My son called again a few times in the weeks that followed. This time, his voice was different. There was hesitation in it, like a man trying to walk on fragile ground. He didn't bring up the money again. He talked about small things, work, the weather, my health. But I could hear the weight behind every word. He was trying to fix something he didn't yet know how to repair. I didn't stop him, but I didn't make it easier either. I answered politely, but the distance remained. It wasn't anger anymore. It was a boundary. Once you've learned peace, you can't trade it back for chaos. Each call ended the same way, with him promising to visit soon, though he never did. I didn't mind. Promises were his way of saying sorry without using the word. Life moved forward quietly. The days blurred together in a rhythm that felt right. The garden began to bloom again, the mornings stretched longer, and I started enjoying the small moments I had once ignored, the way the sunlight hit the windows, the sound of the birds near the fence, the slow passing of time. There was no tension, no guilt, just simplicity. I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone anymore. For the first time in years, I had chosen myself over my role as someone else's mother. That wasn't selfishness. It was survival. I still think about him sometimes, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet understanding. He's still my son. I'll always love him. But love doesn't mean letting someone treat you like an afterthought. He had his chance to value what he had, and when he didn't, life taught him through silence what words never could. Every time his card gets declined or his plans fall through, I hope he remembers that moment, the one where he realized I was no longer his safety net. I hope he learns that you can't treat people like they'll always wait for you. Even mothers have limits. When I walk past Clara's bakery now, she waves through the window, flower on her hands, her daughter beside her. They look happy, steady, alive. And every time I see them, I'm reminded of one simple truth. Kindness never goes unnoticed. It may take time, but it always finds its way back, one way or another. That's what came after. Not guilt, not regret, just peace, baked fresh in the life of someone who truly deserved it. When I look back now, it all feels distant, like a story that happened to someone else. The anger, the disappointment, the quiet humiliation, they've all faded into something softer, something easier to live with. What remains is clarity. I finally understand that respect isn't something you demand. It's something people reveal through how they treat you when they no longer need you. My son had everything I once prayed for him to have: comfort, stability, and a life free from struggle. But somewhere in that comfort, he forgot the hands that built it. He forgot that birthdays aren't about celebration, they're about remembrance. And when he didn't remember me, I learned that the surest way to be respected is to stop giving where gratitude has died. The moment I sent that check, I didn't just write an amount, I drew a line. I wasn't punishing him. I was freeing myself from the illusion that love must always be unconditional. Some conditions, like respect and effort, aren't selfish to expect. They're necessary. It took me most of my life to realize that silence can be an answer, and stillness can be strength. I used to think standing up for yourself meant fighting back, proving your worth, or forcing people to understand you. But sometimes power looks like walking away, changing the locks, rewriting the paperwork, or mailing a check to someone who deserves it more. It's not revenge, it's restoration. It's the quiet act of taking back what you once gave freely to people who mistook it for their right. When my son stopped calling that week, I thought it would hurt. But it didn't. The space he left behind filled with something far more meaningful: peace. The kind that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. I've learned that parenthood is a lifelong balance between love and letting go. You spend years teaching your children to stand on their own, only to realize one day that you must also teach yourself to stand apart. There's a pain in that, but also a freedom. When my son called me a few weeks later, his tone was softer. He didn't say sorry, but he didn't need to. I could hear it in his hesitation, in the way his pride had finally given way to reflection. I let him talk, listened with calm patience, and wished him well when he hung up. That was enough. I didn't need him to admit he was wrong. I only needed him to feel the difference between what I once gave him and what he had lost. Life has a way of teaching lessons that words never can. Every so often I receive a loaf of bread from Clara. She never forgets, never skips a week. The smell fills the kitchen, and for a moment the house feels young again, alive with gratitude, purpose, and meaning. That small gesture reminds me that goodness, when given to the right hands, multiplies. It grows roots in places you least expect. She built her life with grace, and I got to be a small part of that foundation. My son, meanwhile, is still learning. I see it in the way his tone has softened when he calls, in the pauses that fill his sentences, in the way he talks more about his daughter and less about his ego. Maybe that's his redemption. Maybe it's enough. I no longer need to control it. Some lessons are best learned quietly, away from comfort, through the echo of one's own choices. Sometimes, late at night, I sit by the window with a blanket wrapped around me, listening to the distant hum of the city. I think about how easily love can become routine, how easily respect can fade when people believe you'll always be there. And I remind myself that I did the right thing, not because it made him suffer, but because it reminded both of us who we really were. I was not just a mother. I was a person, a woman who had given enough, forgiven enough, and finally drawn the line where dignity begins. He said he was too busy for my birthday. I didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't explain. I simply redirected my love towards someone who remembered what kindness feels like. And in doing so, I gave him the one gift he never knew he needed, a reason to grow up. 2 days later, he had 23 missed calls, not from me, but from the life that was finally demanding his attention. Sometimes the best lessons are delivered in silence, sealed in envelopes and signed not with anger but with finality. I didn't lose a son that day. I gained my self-respect back, and that, more than anything, was the real gift.